You're listening to the House of Prog, www.houseofprog.com. It is the last day of August all around the world. Thank you very much for tuning in. This is Crosswinds, a jazz program whose sole purpose is to bring you, 1, good jazz music, and 2, put the groove in your lazy Sunday. It is the Labor Day weekend here in America, so many people are traveling and doing the last bit of outdoors things one does for the summer. We are here till 2 p.m. Eastern Time, bringing you good jazz for your Sunday. Thank you again for tuning in. First hour of this program is big band music. Let's go Rippin' and Runnin' with Gordon Goodwin. big band session gets going with something from Western Canada. The Great Canadian Plains, the Cory Weeds Little Big Band, 2019 album entitled Explosion. Song that you heard was called Ready and Able. Before that, out of the Southwest, Los Angeles area to be more specific, Gordon Goodwin's Big Phat Band, doing a little rippin' and runnin'. We're rippin' and runnin' all morning. Some great jazz for your last day of August. Hope all of you are doing well, and if you're traveling this weekend, because it is Labor Day here in America, I hope that you travel safe and that you don't have any issues with weather and with other drivers. Grab your friends, let them know what you do on your Sunday brunch. We're here till 2 p.m. Eastern Time. We have some new big band music for you starting right now. Last week we featured an old album, but a new discovery for the DJ. An album from the Toshiko Akiyoshi Tabackin Big Band entitled Road Time. Released in 1976. It's an album that I had been searching for quite a long time and finally got it about 10 days ago. We're going to feature a little bit longer track from the album. This one's about 12 minutes long because it gives you a good idea of what Toshiko and Lou did with their big band. Great ensemble writing, but they also let the individual players stretch out. This is something called a drum conference. Toshiko Akiyoshi and Tabackin, he on the tenor saxophone on that track. A little bit longer piece, it's called Drum Conference, featuring the percussion section, featuring Lou on tenor saxophone, and featuring the fine players of the band. Just some really, really cool ensemble passages in that particular track. I do hope you enjoyed it. Something from the Toshiko Akiyoshi Tabackin Big Band here in Crosswinds. Going to change it up just a little bit. This is from a brand new album that's called Without Further Ado, Volume 1. It is the brand new album for the Christian McBride Big Band. A couple of tracks for you in this particular set, beginning with Christian's Big Band, featuring vocalist Jeffrey Osbourne on a track that Jeffrey wrote and originally made popular with his band LTD way back in the 70s. It's called Back in Love Again. You're listening to Crosswinds.
When I look, I'm in, and every time I turn around, back in love, I get mixed emotions. It's the way my feelings flow. Excuse me, I'm only human, love. Sometimes I just don't know. And every time I move, I lose. When I look, I'm in, and every time I turn around, back in love. Back in love again. Back in love. When you put your arms around me, I feel so satisfied. I want to love you forever, but I just can't. No, I can't decide. Every time I move, I lose. When I look, I'm in, and every time I turn around, I'm back in love again. Back in love again. Hey, yeah. Seems like that I'm back in love again. And now it's hard just to be your friend. That's something else I discover, oh, yeah. Guess I just don't ever want it to end. Every time I move, I lose. When I look, I'm in, and every time I turn around, I'm back in love again. Back in love again. Hey, yeah. Seems like that I'm back in love again. Back in love again. Every time I turn around, seems like that I'm back in love again. And I just can't believe it. But seem like I'm back in love again. I feel like I'm back in
everybody, said everybody knows I'm moaning. Everybody knows, said everybody knows. Everybody knows, everybody knows, everybody knows. Yes, I spend plenty of days and nights alone in my grief, and I pray, really and truly pray that somebody will come and bring me relief. Everybody know that everybody say that everybody knows I'm. Everybody knows I'm moaning 'cause of all the trouble I seen. Life's a losing gamble to me. Cares and woes that got me moaning. Every evening find me moaning. I'm alone and crying the blues. I'm so tired of paying these dues. Everybody knows I'm moaning. Lord, I spend plenty of days and nights alone in my grief. Yes, but I pray, really and truly pray, somebody will come and bring me relief. Every morning find me moaning 'cause of all the trouble I seen. Life's a losing gamble to me. Everybody knows I'm moaning. Everybody, 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 everybody knows I'm moaning in the morning, in the morning, in the evening, in the morning, in the evening. Said everybody knows I'm moaning. Everybody, 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 everybody. Lord, I spend plenty of days and nights alone and alone and alone and alone and alone and alone in my grief. But I pray somebody really and truly will come and bring me relief. Everybody knows, everybody knows, everybody knows, everybody knows. Everybody, everybody knows I'm moaning. of days, plenty of days, plenty of days, and nights alone in my grief. But I pray, really and truly pray, somebody will come and bring me relief. Everybody knows I'm moaning, 'cause of all the trouble I seen. Life's a losing gamble to me. Everybody knows I'm moaning. Said everybody knows.
Two tracks from the brand new Christian McBride Big Band album in that set. The album itself is called Without Further Ado, Volume 1, which follows that there will be a Volume 2. We hope so. Jose James on the vocals, doing a song written by Bobby Timmons, piano player back in the late 1950s, originally recorded by the Art Blakey and the Jazz Messengers Band. Classic jazz piece is called Moanin. Before that, Jeffrey Osbourne on the vocals, doing a song that he made popular with his band LTD way back in the 70s. A song called Back in Love Again. Without Further Ado, Volume 1. Very, very cool big band album. Probably getting the publicity for a reunion of 2/3 of the Police. Andy Summers playing guitar and Sting doing some vocals on a Police track called Murder by Numbers that we featured last week on the program. Real cool album by Mr. Christian McBride and his big band. Before we play the last track of the big band session for this last day in August, I want to remind you that we do the first hour of Crosswinds every Sunday and give it up to big bands past, present, and future. We're going to get you close to the top of the hour by doing something live from the Buddy Rich Big Band. This is one of his signature pieces, if not the best known piece associated with his big band. And of course, there will be a drum solo. Buddy Rich taking us close to the top of the hour with something called the Channel 1 Suite. We wrap up hour number 1 of Crosswinds, the big band session, doing something live from the Buddy Rich Big Band. That's a piece called Channel 1 Suite. Buddy, of course, on drums. Bob Minzer playing tenor saxophone on that particular track. I had the privilege of seeing the Buddy Rich Band live with him at the helm, and they did that track, and it was just brilliant. Buddy Rich, for those who don't know, is probably the king of all drummers. You can have all of your rock drummers of the day, but they all come from Buddy Rich. Absolutely. Hope you enjoyed that track. Hope you enjoyed the first hour of the program. It is always big band music. Come back next weekend. We'll do this again. The first hour will be big band music, but we're not done yet. No. Getting into hour number 2 of Crosswinds, courtesy of the wonderful people at the House of Prague, www.houseofprague.com. We are here for another 2 hours. Here till about 2 p.m. Eastern Time. We'll get you as close to 2 p.m. as we can. We do have some new music coming up in the next 2 hours. Something brand new from Brad Mehldau. His brand new album is called Ride Into the Sun. It was released on Friday. We have a couple of tracks from that album to play for you in the next couple hours. We also have something brand new from Paul McCandless, featured on a brand new album by the piano player Art Lande. We'll have a track from that album coming up after a bit. But we will start by going into the stone. This is Earth, Wind, and Fire.
as good as can be expected in these uncertain times. But there must be many reasons for our precipitous decline. Blame it on the white man, blame it on the booze, blame it on the Arabs, or you can blame it on the Jews. Blame it on the Chinese, cause they grown by leaps and bounds. There's more than enough and plenty, blame to go around. Blame it on religion, you can blame it on the press, blame it on the bureaucrats, or chalk it up to stress. Blame it on a mindset where waste and fraud abound. Yes, there's more than enough and plenty, blame to go around. Any excuse will do. Any excuse will do. When there's all this blame to go around, any excuse will do. Any excuse will do. Any excuse will do. When there's all this blame to go around, any excuse will do. Blame it on the unions or blame it on your boss. Blame it on inflation, blame it on the cost. You might blame it on a system that is clearly broken down. There's more than enough and plenty, blame to go around. Blame it on the others, blame it on the freaks, blame it on the brothers, blame it on the geeks. You could blame it on the theory that money trickles down. Yes, there's more than enough and plenty, blame to go around. Any excuse will do. Any excuse will do. With all this blame to go around, any excuse will do. Any excuse will do. Any excuse will do. With all this blame to go around, any excuse will do. Is this what it's coming down to? Somebody just tell me. There's so much blame being thrown around. Huh. Everyone's looking for an excuse to hate something or somebody. More than enough. Oh. Plenty of blame to go around. More than enough. Plenty of blame to go around. I can't take this no more. More than enough. Plenty of blame to go around. More than enough. Plenty of blame to go around. Play it. Yeah. Make it real.
Hour number 2 and beyond of Crosswinds. Get started with something from Tower of Power. From their 2020 album entitled Step Up, that's a song called Any Excuse Will Do. Before that, from 2010, a conglomeration of musicians that called themselves Global Noize, doing a little Sly and the Family Stone. It's a family affair, and we began with Earth, Wind, and Fire. Classic music from them. Song called In the Stone. It is Crosswinds. Some good jazz for you on this Sunday, and this is Weather Report. Something from Weather Report in that set from their album Tail Spinnin'. Joseph Zawinul on keyboards, Wayne Shorter on soprano saxophone, Alfonso Johnson on bass, Leon Chancellor on drums. That's a piece written by Zawinul called The Man with the Green Shirt. I hope you enjoyed that one. One of the premier jazz fusion groups in that particular set. You're listening to Crosswinds on this last day of August. Thank you so much for tuning in. We approach September. It's a holiday weekend in America, so hopefully all of you enjoy the holiday weekend. Traditionally, the last weekend of summer here in the United States. School is getting back in session, as we all know too well, over the past week. Football is back, both soccer and American football. The jazz is always here in Crosswinds. Brand new music to start off the 3 songs in this set. This is the title track from an EP entitled Say No More. Art Lande on piano. Bruce Williamson and Paul McCandless on saxophones. Paul McCandless best known for his work in Oregon, and we do have an Oregon track in this set as well. But we begin brand new music from Mr. McCandless. It's called Say No More. This is Crosswinds.
Say
We did 3 songs in that set. All of the songs featured members of the band Oregon. Wrapping it up with Oregon from 1992 from an album of theirs called Always, Never, and Forever. Ralph Towner on piano and classical guitar. Paul McCandless on oboe. Glenn Moore on bass. Mark Walker on percussion. Oregon has been around in some way, shape, or form since the late 1960s. They were originally part of the Paul Winter Consort. And if you're not familiar with the Paul Winter Consort, they were one of the leaders in establishing the genre of music that people have come to call New Age. Before we heard from Oregon, we heard from Ralph Towner on 12-string guitar, Eddie Gomez on bass, Bill Bruford on drums, from a 1997 album that the 3 of them did together called If Summer Has Its Ghosts. Very highly recommended. It's straight-up jazz, guitar, piano, bass, and drums, Bill Bruford's drums. And it's just a real cool acoustic album. The song that you heard in that set was called Somersaults. And we started off with some brand new music, a 5-song EP entitled Say No More. We played the title track from the EP. Bruce Williamson on saxophone, Paul McCandless on saxophone, Art Lande on piano. Hope you enjoyed that piece. It is Crosswinds for your Sunday. Thank you very much for tuning in. A little bit more than halfway through the program, you still have plenty of time to let your friends know how you spend your Sunday brunch. See if you can't get them to do the same. We're here till about 2 p.m. Eastern Time. This next set is going to feature the piano playing of McCoy Tyner. 3 different settings for Mr. Tyner. I do hope you enjoy the set. We begin with something from the John Coltrane Quartet. We'll get it right if we talk enough. John Coltrane on tenor saxophone, McCoy Tyner on piano, Matt Garrison on bass, Elvin Jones on drums. This is something called Impressions. We did 3 tracks in that set featuring the piano of Mr. McCoy Tyner. We wrap it up with something from 1967 from an album of his called The Real McCoy. The song that you heard was called Contemplation. McCoy Tyner on piano, Joe Henderson on tenor saxophone, Ron Carter on bass, Elvin Jones on drums. Before that, some solo piano music from McCoy Tyner, a piece of his called Memories. And we started off with the classic John Coltrane quartet. John Coltrane on tenor saxophone, McCoy Tyner on piano, Jimmy Garrison on bass, and Elvin Jones on drums. About it once you hear the 2 tracks from the album that we're going to play. The first one is called Satellite.
key off and belong to where I come from. Sir, no sir, we have no power in the air. The battle's on the ground. some dude with a stilted attitude that you learn from TV. You'll learn to, but I'll be connecting everything. The traffic in my town, high on the sound. Right into the sun, but I ain't gonna go down low again, high on the sound.
Two songs in that set from the brand new Brad Mehldau album. The album is called Ride Into the Sun. It is an album featuring the music of Elliott Smith, singer-songwriter from the early part of the 21st century. Song you just heard was called Colorbars. Chris Thiele on vocals and mandolin, joining Brad on the piano on that particular track. And before that, a piece called Satellite. Very, very cool album. Style-wise, it's all over the place. There's some jazz, there's some classical, there's a little bit of rock, but it is a very eclectic album from Mr. Brad Mehldau, as one comes to expect. I do hope you enjoyed that set. You'll be hearing more from that album in the coming weeks. We're going to keep it going in Crosswinds with a little bit of that bass. We go to Poland for this one. This is Kinga and her trio doing a Charlie Parker piece. It's called Donna Lee. We let the young ladies play bass in that particular set, and they do it rather well, don't they? From India, that is Mohini Day, from her debut solo album, released in 2023. The song that you just heard was called Colored Goddess. Mohini Day, currently on tour with Willow Smith. She is also in the progressive metal band known as Darwin, along with Greg Howe and Simon Phillips. You'll hear some new music from Darwin tomorrow evening on my other program here at the House of Prague, something called The Seventh House. Also in that set from Poland, Kinga and her quartet, I think I said trio, doing a Charlie Parker piece called Donna Lee, which has become kind of a jazz bass player's kind of necessity, shall we say. All jazz bass players need to know Donna Lee, since Jaco Pastorius recorded it many, many years ago and just blew it away. Hope you enjoyed that set. Kinga Glick, never played in the United States. I wish he would come over to these shores. Well worth watching videos of her in concert and pick up her music as well. You're listening to Crosswinds. Sorry for the streaming problems that we've been having intermittently over the past couple hours. It's one of the many reasons why I am changing address at the end of this month. I have had cable issues for about 3 months now, and it's just gotten to the point where it is ridiculous, and I am breaking my lease and moving to a new place at the end of this month, which will be better. But thank you for hanging in there. We still have some music to play for you before we get out of here at the top of the hour. We go to Nolens by way of New York City for a band called Afroskull. This is from their second album called To Obscurity and Beyond. This is called Redemption.
pities all the world around you'll ever know. Rain and thunder in the dark, Noah, God sent it. Sing redemption everywhere you go. Praise the Lord, He has led you. Noah. Thirst and hunger on the rock, Moses, God gave you. Pain and sorrows all the world around you'll ever know. Fire and fury in your talk, Moses, God save you. Sing redemption everywhere you go. Praise the Lord, He has led you. Moses.
Little redemption in that set. Wrapping up the two songs with something from Blood, Sweat, and Tears. Early 1970s, the album was called Blood, Sweat, and Tears 4. That's Dick Halligan on trombone, David Clayton Thomas on the vocals. The song that you heard was called Redemption. Before that, something from Afroskull, a band that got started in New Orleans, now is based out of New York. They haven't really done anything in about 13, 14 years. And I certainly wish they would. Real good horns, real good rock and roll, real good jazz as well. The album was called To Obscurity and Beyond, and the song that you heard from that album was also called Redemption. One last set to leave you with before we close out with some Earth, Wind, and Fire. Some Sunday music in this particular set. We start with a song from an album called What Were Once Vices, Now Are Habits, the Doobie Brothers, Another Park, Another Sunday.
Thinking back shade, it's just another sunny Sunday. She dodges the light like Blanche Dubois. Bright colors fade away on such a sunny Sunday. She waits for the night to fall. Then she points a pistol through the door, and she aims at the street light while the freeway hisses. Dogs bark as the gun falls to the floor. The street light's still burning. She always misses. But the day she hits, that's the day she'll leave. That one little victory, that's all she needs. She pulls the shade, it's just another sunny Monday. She waits for the night to fall.
Sunday
last set of the day for this episode of Crosswinds consisted of 4 songs, and we wrap it up with a band out of Toronto, Ontario, Canada, by the name of Bad Bad Not Good. Mid-Spiral is the name of their album that was released a little bit earlier in the year 2025. The song that you heard from the album is called Sunday Afternoon's Dream. Before that, also from Canada, K.D. Lang, from her Watershed album released in 2008. The song that you heard was called Sunday. Joni Mitchell was in there as well, with something from her album Turbulent Indigo that was released toward the end of the 1990s. The song that you heard was called Sunny Sunday. And the Doobie Brothers were in there from about 1975, maybe, 1976. What Were Once Vices Are Now Habits was the name of the album, and the song that you heard was called Another Park, Another Sunday. I want to thank everybody for tuning in this episode of Crosswinds. Thank you very much for joining me on this jazz journey that we do every Sunday. And with that in mind, I want to remind you that we do this every Sunday, 11 a.m. until 2 p.m. Eastern Time here at the House of Prog, www.houseofprog.com. We will be back here next week with another live program. So grab your friends, let them know what you do on brunch on Sundays. See if you can't get them to join you. We'll do this all over again. First hour of this program will be always big band music. Going to close things out with something from Earth, Wind & Fire, from an early 1980s album entitled Faces. This is the title track, and until we meet again, may all of you be well, be blessed, and know that you are loved. You've been in Crosswinds. I am the Mercurial Stranger.